Morning arrived in the Whitlock Valley like breath on glass, slow, fragile, almost invisible at first. A thin seam of light slid between the distant hills, finding its way through fog that clung to the low ground and the black ribs of the trees. Dew had crusted overnight on the withered grass, each blade tipped with a bead of cold silver. The small homestead crouched at the edge of a clearing, rough timber walls darkened by years of smoke, a roof patched with wooden shingles that had begun to curl. Nothing about it was grand, but it stood, proof that a family could carve permanence out of wilderness. Inside, the air was still and heavy with the faint scent of ash. The heart of the house, held the last dull glow of yesterday's fire. A single ember blinked in the grayness, like an eye reluctant to close. The room itself was one space serving every purpose known to domestic life: cooking, eating, sleeping, storing, mending. The floor was hardened earth, smoothed by countless steps and the dragging of chairs. Against one wall stood a wide plank table, scarred with knife marks and the black rings of old candles. Pegs along the beams carried everything from tools to children's garments. Every object spoke of use. Nothing existed for beauty alone. The first stir of life came not from voices, but from movement. A quilt lifted, a shadow leaned over the hearth, a handful of dry twigs met the ember's faint glow. Breath coasted back into flame. The sound of kindling catching, the small crackle of twigs surrendering to heat, announced that another day had begun. Pale light crept through oiled paper windows, tracing the rough shapes of a family stirring from sleep. They did not speak. Words in the morning were unnecessary. Routine had replaced language long ago. Outside, the rooster's call traveled over the fields. A second answered from the neighboring farm, half a mile away. Between those two voices lay a wilderness that was still more powerful than the men who tried to tame it. Forest pressed close to the clearing, a wall of pine and maple that breathed mist and shadow. Beyond the trees ran the river, slow, brown, reliable. It provided fish, water for washing, and sometimes, when swollen by rain, a reminder of how little control any colonist truly possessed. The family's rhythm unfolded as the light strengthened. The father's boots struck the floor with the same dull weight each morning. The mother's hands, already accustomed to the day's labor, moved through gestures learned from her own mother, coaxing fire, measuring cornmeal, checking the drying herbs that hung above the hearth. The children stirred reluctantly, wrapping themselves in wool that smelled faintly of smoke and lye. There was no hurry. There was also no rest. Work filled every minute between waking and dark. Outside, frost still held the corners of the fence where shade lingered. The well stood a few steps from the door, its rope stiff with cold. Drawing water was the first task of every day. The buckets creak and splash, carried through the quiet air, echoing off the trees. Each drop raised from that depth represented muscle, time, and endurance. In a land rich with rivers, water was never free. Back inside, the scent of cornmeal thickening in the pot, mixed with the sharper odor of smoke. The house had no chimney flue, only a rough opening that allowed more smoke to escape than the family could spare for warmth. Soot filmed the rafters like a second ceiling. When sunlight slanted through the room, it turned the haze to gold, a transient beauty no one paused to admire. The day demanded other things. As the meal cooked, tools were checked. The axe head tightened to its handle with a wedge of green wood, the saw's teeth filed with care. Metal was scarce, and every tool was an inheritance, not a possession. To lose or break one was to invite hunger months later. The father's hands were scarred and calloused, the map of his survival written in them. When he stepped outside to the field, the air wrapped him in the smell of thawing soil and pine resin. His world was bounded by what his own labor could reach. The field itself was both victory and battle scar. Tree stumps studded the ground, reminders of how recently forest had stood here. Around their edges sprouted thin blades of wheat and patches of corn, fragile proof that cultivation could coexist with wilderness. Every spring the land demanded renewal, fences repaired, furrows recut, weeds pried from the soil with a hoe that had belonged to his father before him. The rhythm of motion, the swing, the stoop, the lift, defined the measure of his life more precisely than any calendar. While the men worked outside, the interior world of the cabin pulsed with its own activity. The mother's day unfolded around the fire. She spun flax into thread, stirred pots, scoured bowls with sand. The smaller children gathered kindling or beat dust from blankets with sticks. Each sound, scrape of spoon, crackle of logs, rhythmic pull of the spinning wheel, wove itself into a kind of domestic music. It was not silence they lived in, but a tapestry of humble noises marking each necessity accomplished. Mid-morning brought a different scent, wet wool and fresh wood smoke. Laundry day transformed the clearing into a theater of steam. Iron kettles stood on stones, filled with water hauled from the well and warmed by small fires. Cloth boiled with soap made from lye and fat, a bitter smell that burned the throat. Rinsing meant more trips to the well, more hauling, more bending. Nothing in colonial life came without weight. Noon came with little ceremony. The family paused for a cold corn cake and milk if there was any left. The sun by now had burned through the mist, leaving the air clear and sharp. Forest birds filled the silence the people left. Rest lasted only long enough for breath to return. By afternoon, the rhythm began again, plowing, mending, chopping, spinning. Time itself felt circular, not linear, each day mirroring the one before it, altered only by weather and the small triumphs of survival. As the sun slid westward, shadows lengthened across the field. The temperature dropped quickly once the light withdrew. In the distance, wolves called, a thin sound, half music, half threat. The father stacked the last of the logs against the barn wall and turned homeward. Smoke already rose from the chimney, gray against the amber sky. The smell of boiling mush greeted him before the door opened. Inside, the fire had brightened into an orange roar. The children sat close, their faces illuminated in the flicker. Supper was not a feast, it was fuel. Cornmeal fried crisp in an iron pan, a thin strip of salted pork for each. Hunger was constant, but starvation was the enemy they had learned to keep at bay through discipline rather than plenty. Each mouthful carried the satisfaction of endurance. When the bowls were empty, the household entered its evening rhythm. Tools were checked, clothing dried near the fire, bedding shaken out. The smallest children dozed first, curling near the warmth like kittens. The older ones tended the last chores, sweeping embers into the hearth's center, covering the coals so they would live until morning. The father stepped outside one last time to listen. The forest whispered its endless conversation of wind and branch. Stars, brilliant and unfamiliar, pricked the sky. Returning indoors, he lowered the bar across the door. Safety was a relative word in a world without locks, neighbors miles away, and wolves, or worse, always near. Yet the simple barrier of wood against wood provided a sense of control that was almost faith. Inside, the world felt contained. Firelight softened every edge, turned sweat-stained walls into amber stone. Fatigue replaced anxiety. For a few hours at least, the family could rest. Night in the colonies was not true darkness, but layers of gray and orange, the dim afterglow of embers reflecting off low beams.
By late April, the air smelled of sap and smoke. Thomas Whitlock's world widened to include his neighbors again, the men whose cabins dotted the valley. Each spring they helped one another mend what winter had broken. Fence rails were lifted, roofs patched, oxen borrowed to pull the heavier logs from the clearing. There was no coin exchanged, only effort and reputation. A man who lent his strength today could expect the same when his own walls sagged or his own field needed plowing. In this way, the colony bound itself not by law alone, but by quiet obligation. The forest that hemmed them in was both enemy and ally. It provided timber, fuel, and game, yet it waited to reclaim any ground left untended. Saplings already pushed up between the stumps of last year's clearing. Every few days, Thomas carried his axe into the woods to cut deadfall and watch for bear tracks near the corn crib. The wilderness pressed close, always visible through the cracks between fence rails, always whispering beyond the edge of the field. Inside the cabin, the work of preparation never ceased. Mary's world was measured by the fire's breath, its heat, its smoke, the way it cooked and consumed. She rendered tallow for candles, twisted flax into thread, and scrubbed clothes until her hands were raw. Water for washing came cold from the well. Warming it meant hours of tending the kettle. The clean scent of wet linen mingled with the bitter tang of soap made from ashes and lard. Nothing smelled gentle. Everything smelled alive with effort. Children's tasks were smaller, but no less essential. They gathered chips of wood, filled buckets, fetched herbs from the small garden behind the cabin. The garden was Mary's claim against hunger. A rectangle of earth, no larger than a rug, bordered with stones. It held sage, thyme, onion, and beans, each plant staked and labeled in her own careful hand. The soil there was dark and rich, amended each year with ashes and compost from the hearth. She knelt among the rows every evening, her skirt brushing the earth, her hair catching the low sun. That garden fed not only the family's bodies, but their belief that labor could shape destiny. By early May, the trees burst into full leaf, and with them came insects, mosquitoes in clouds, black flies that bit until the skin bled. Smoke from the hearth drifted through the open door to drive them back, mixing with the heavy sweetness of new growth. The air vibrated with life. Frogs calling from the marsh, bees threading through blossoms, the steady creak of the well rope. For all its harshness, the land had a beauty that could still quiet the mind. On rare evenings when the day's work ended before darkness, the family stepped outside to watch the sky deepen from blue to violet. Bats flickered above the treetops, and the first stars appeared like cold sparks. Those few minutes between labor and nightfall were their closest approach to rest. June brought heat that pressed down like a hand. The river shrank to a slow brown ribbon. The fields buzzed with cicadas. The Whitlocks rose before dawn to work in cooler air. Sweat darkened their linen clothes within the hour, and the smell of salt and earth clung to them like another skin. Mary spread freshly washed garments on bushes to dry, the white cloths flashing like signals among the green leaves. The sound of the spinning wheel carried faintly through the open door, its rhythm steady and patient. Harvest was months away, yet every hour of labor aimed toward it. Corn had to be hoed, beans trained to climb, the barn roof mended before autumn rains. Even leisure, if it could be called that, consisted of maintenance, sharpening blades, repairing handles, checking the traps along the creek. When fatigue threatened to dull the body, necessity awakened it again. A loose fence meant lost pigs. A missed weed meant fewer ears of corn. Survival tolerated no laziness. Once a week, weather permitting, the family walked the narrow path to the meeting house. The journey itself was part of worship. A mile through woods and open field, the sound of boots on packed soil, the rustle of skirts in tall grass. The building stood plain and square on a rise overlooking the valley, its whitewashed boards gleaming against the trees. Inside, benches faced a pulpit hewn from pine, unpainted and bare. The sermons were long, the air close, but the people came because gathering confirmed that they were not alone in their struggle. Their shared silence was as sacred as any prayer. When they returned home, the cabin seemed smaller but somehow steadier. The world outside could shift, politics, prices, weather, but within those four walls, the pattern endured. Mary resumed her spinning, Thomas checked the grain bin. Even the children sensed the gravity of Sunday and moved quietly, as if to keep the peace intact. By midsummer, storms rolled in from the coast. They announced themselves with a sudden darkening, the smell of ozone and damp soil, and then the hammer of rain against the roof. Lightning lit the cabin in sharp flashes that turned every shadow into a momentary negative. The sound on the shingles was deafening, but the family welcomed it. Rain meant the wells would fill and the fields would swell with green. When it ended, the air hung heavy and clean, and the world looked newly washed. The river, however, did not forgive excess. One season out of every few, it rose beyond its banks, spreading cold water through the low fields and leaving behind silt that killed young plants. When that happened, Thomas rebuilt rather than despair. The colonies taught resilience by removing every other choice. As August approached, the first hints of gold touched the leaves at the edge of the woods. The nights cooled again, and the smell of smoke returned to the air. Preparations for harvest began. Scythes sharpened, barrels repaired, cellars cleaned of last year's remnants. There was satisfaction in these motions, an awareness that the wheel of the year had turned another full circle without breaking them. When the sun finally dropped behind the ridge each evening, the light pooled across the valley like melted brass. From the doorway of their cabin, the Whitlocks could see the faint glow of other homesteads, thin columns of smoke rising straight into the still air. The sight carried a quiet reassurance. Each plume marked another family alive, another fire burning, another fragile victory over distance and solitude. Inside, the day ended as it always had, with the soft murmur of fire, the slow dimming of light, and the knowledge that tomorrow would begin again with the same breath, the same ember coaxed back to flame. As the calendar edged toward autumn, the Whitlocks' world changed color and texture. The high sun softened, pouring down a slower amber light that seemed to cling to everything it touched. The fields, which were once a bright and tender green, ripened into a quilt of golds and russets. Corn stood shoulder-high now, the tassels whispering whenever the wind passed. The air smelled of dust, hay, and slow decay, the perfume of things reaching completion. Morning chores took on new urgency. Each hour of starlight became a countdown to harvest. The barns were cleared, their floors swept of last winter's straw, their beams checked for weakness. Baskets were patched, scythes filed, ropes retwisted from hemp fiber that had hung drying all summer under the eaves. Mary filled jars with the last of the early fruit, each sealed with wax and cloth. The shelves of the cellar began to look like a map of endurance, glass glowing faintly in the half-light, each container a promise against hunger. On the warmest days, bees crowded around the doorframe where drips of sap and honey had tempted them from the hives. The constant hum mixed with the clatter of tools and the muffled thud of wooden mallets. From sunrise to sunset, sound filled the clearing. Not chaos, but the overlapping rhythm of labor that gave meaning to silence when night finally arrived. The woods surrounding the farm were alive with movement. Deer grazed on the stubble near the field's edge. Squirrels darted through branches heavy with nuts. The family watched these signs with a hunter's eye. Autumn meant abundance, but it also meant preparation for the scarcity ahead. Thomas checked his traps along the riverbank, their positions marked by subtle cuts on tree bark. A single rabbit or muskrat caught today might feed the household when snow lay deep in February. Every task carried both memory and foresight. The Whitlocks had learned to think in seasons, not days. What failed to be done in August would return as punishment in January. They did not call this wisdom, they simply called it living. When the nights grew cool enough for breath to show in the dark, Mary began the ritual of airing blankets and washing heavy clothes in the
Evenings came earlier now. The cabin's single room glowed like an ember against the encroaching dark. The fire's heat pressed close, carrying with it the sense of drying herbs and roasting squash. Shadows trembled across the beams as the flames breathed and settled. Outside, the first thin ice formed along the edges of the water trough, delicate as glass. The season of endurance was approaching again. Work continued after sunset. The family's hands learned to move by feel. Thomas mended harness leather beside the hearth, while Mary wove strips of cloth into a new rug for the floor. The children sorted beans by candlelight, their small fingers quick and sure. The tiny flame wavered each time someone breathed too near it. Wax dripped in narrow rivers down the candlestick, hardening before it reached the base. Light was precious. Every inch of wick represented time, hours traded for tallow, for beeswax, for life itself. Sometimes, when the moon was full and the night unusually still, the sounds of distant neighbors reached them across the valley. The faint strike of an axe, a dog's bark, the echo of laughter carried by the wind. Such moments reminded the Whitlocks that their isolation was shared, that others were enduring the same unending cycle of work and weather. The colony was not a single settlement, but a constellation of fires burning against the same darkness. On Sundays, when travel was possible, Thomas walked with his family to the meeting house again. The autumn air made every sound sharper, the crunch of leaves, the creak of wagon wheels on the frozen ruts. Inside, the congregation sat in their heavy coats, breath rising faintly in the cold interior. The minister's voice rolled through the bare room, solemn and slow. He spoke of providence, of patience, of reward beyond this world. Heads bowed not only in faith, but in exhaustion. Each sermon was a reminder that endurance itself was virtue. After service, the people lingered outside, faces flushed from both cold and companionship. They exchanged news: who had lost a cow, who had finished harvest, who was expecting a child. Conversation was spare but essential, a weaving of small facts into the fabric of community. When the Whitlocks returned home, the valley seemed larger again, the boundaries of their lives extended by the presence of others unseen yet near.
The first snow arrived early that year, drifting down while the trees still held some of their leaves. The flakes settled softly on the roof and melted at once, but their appearance announced the inevitable. Thomas walked the perimeter of the fields, inspecting every fence and post. He listened to the hush that snow always brought, the muffling of sound that turned the world inward. In that quiet, he could almost hear the slow heartbeat of the land, preparing to sleep. Back inside, Mary measured the stores, sacks of grain stacked in the corner, jars lined in rows, smoked meat hanging from the rafters. It would be enough if nothing spoiled. The knowledge that survival depended on such calculations kept her awake long after the fire dimmed. Outside, frost crept across the window panes in branching patterns that looked like trees drawn in silver. The moon, high and thin, cast a blue sheen over the fields where the cornstalks now stood brittle and pale. Days shortened to the length of labor and little more. The family moved through the house like figures in a slow, repeating dance, adding wood, stirring pots, patching clothes, checking traps, reading the weather in the color of dawn. There was beauty in that monotony, though they rarely named it. Each repeated action confirmed their continued existence, and that, in this world, was triumph enough. When at last the year turned fully to winter, the Whitlock cabin seemed smaller, its walls closing in against the cold. The fire became their clock and their companion. Outside the window, the valley disappeared beneath snow and silence. Inside, the air glowed with warmth and the steady, breathing light of survival. Spring unfolded in layers. At first, it was only color, a faint green haze along the edges of the woods, the blush of new leaves against bark that looked dead a week before. Then came sound, the quick trill of returning birds, the liquid gurgle of water finding its way between stones, the soft percussion of rain on the cabin roof. Each sense awoke in order, as if the land itself were taking stock of its own rebirth. For the Whitlocks, that awakening meant motion. Sleep grew shorter, days longer. The children rose at dawn to gather last season's straw from the barn floor, shaking free the dust and spreading it over muddy paths. Thomas began the long process of reshaping his fields, turning, leveling, mending. The soil was stubborn after its long freezing, but it yielded under his weight and will. With every furrow he carved, the scent of earth grew richer, almost sweet. Mary's hands were never still. She cleaned and patched, boiled lye soap, scrubbed soot from the hearthstone until it shone dull gray. Her motions carried the quiet satisfaction of order restored. The cabin, once shuttered and smoky through the dark months, now breathed. Windows stood open. Sunlight slid across the floor in slow golden rectangles. She listened to the distant strikes of Thomas's hoe and felt each as a reassurance that life, despite its fragility, had chosen once more to continue. The first shoots pushed through by mid-April. Thomas marked the progress daily, noting which rows warmed fastest, which corners held shade too long. He spoke less now, conserving breath for work, but his silence was full of intent. The land demanded total attention in these weeks between thaw and heat. Any delay could undo months of preparation. Rains returned in earnest. They came without warning, rolling over the hills like smoke and breaking upon the clearing with a roar that drowned every other sound. The world turned silver, blurred by water. For hours the family waited inside, watching the sheets of rain cross the fields and pool in the wagon ruts. When it ended, everything gleamed, the trunks of trees, the stones in the path, the roof itself. The smell that followed was heavy and alive, as if the forest exhaled after holding its breath all winter.
By May, the valley had transformed. Grass rose to the height of a man's knee. The river, freed from ice, ran swift and brown with snowmelt. Birds nested under the eaves, stealing stray bits of flax for their homes. The days lengthened until dusk seemed a hesitation rather than an ending. The Whitlocks worked through that light as though afraid it might suddenly be withdrawn. Thomas moved methodically along the rows of corn, setting each hill, tamping each seed with the heel of his hand. Sweat darkened his shirt, and insects circled his head in lazy spirals. He paused only to drink from the dipper hanging near the well, water shining on his beard before it vanished into the heat. Across the field, Mary's figure bent among the beans, her bonnet catching the light each time she straightened. The children weeded near her, small shapes swallowed by the green. From a distance, the scene might have looked peaceful. Up close, it was simply life measured in breath and effort. When the sun climbed high, the air thickened until sound itself seemed to slow. Even the cicadas faltered. The smell of pine resin drifted from the woods. Tar softened on the wagon wheels. The Whitlocks retreated indoors only long enough to eat, a meal of bread, milk, and whatever berries the children had found along the fence. The interior of the cabin was dim and cool, the one mercy of its small windows. Beyond the threshold, heat shimmered over the fields like invisible fire. Evenings brought a brief gentleness. Shadows lengthened, the air cooled, and the world exhaled. Smoke from the cooking fire rose straight upward in the stillness. Frogs began their low chorus from the marsh near the river. The family's work slowed to smaller gestures, stacking tools, covering seedlings against the chance of frost, sweeping dust from the floor. The light lingered, golden and forgiving, before finally slipping behind the ridge. In that last moment before darkness, the valley looked almost tame, almost civilized, a fragile illusion that would vanish with the next storm or hunger.
By midsummer, the valley thrummed with life. Fields hummed with insects. The river glittered like metal under the noon sun. The children's laughter carried farther now that windows stood open. Sometimes a neighbor passed along the distant road, wagon wheels crunching on gravel, and raised a hand in greeting. Those brief glimpses of another human face were reminders that they were part of something larger, an unspoken fraternity of endurance scattered across the colonies. The days rolled together, indistinguishable yet cumulative. The Whitlocks woke, worked, ate, and slept in rhythm with the world that held them. No event marked one sunrise from the next, but slowly, imperceptibly, the corn began to tassel, the beans to flower, the air to thicken with the scent of maturity. The long labor of the first half of the year was drawing toward its reward. When the last light of another evening faded behind the ridge, Thomas sat on the step before the cabin, the rough wood warm under his palms. The sky above the trees deepened to indigo, a single star burning at its center. Behind him, the quiet murmurs of his family drifted through the open door, the clink of a pot, the low shuffle of movement, the sigh of fatigue. Before him stretched the land he had claimed with his own hands, still rough, still uncertain, but alive. The breeze carried the scent of cut grass and wood smoke. For a brief moment, the distance between wilderness and home seemed to disappear, as though the two had finally learned to share the same breath. Inside, Mary banked the fire for the night. The room darkened to the color of embers. Outside, crickets began their endless chorus. The world, for all its hardship, had entered a season of calm. The Whitlocks, without speaking, surrendered to it. Sleep came easily. Beyond the walls, the forest breathed. The stars, indifferent and steady, kept watch. Autumn announced itself not with sudden chill, but with a slow softening of the light. The sun withdrew fraction by fraction until afternoons seemed brushed with gold dust. Leaves shifted through every possible shade of fire, crimson, amber, the brown of drying tobacco, before releasing their grip on the branches. The sound of their fall filled the valley like rain without water. For the Whitlocks, this turning of the year was the signal for harvest. All summer's labor had aimed at this moment when the land's promise would be tested. The cornfield, once green and whispering, now stood dry and brittle. Stalks cracked underfoot, shedding husks that rattled like paper. The air carried the faint sweetness of ripened grain and the musk of earth newly opened by scythes. From dawn until dusk the family moved through the rows, cutting, binding, stacking. The rhythm of their work was ancient, the thud of blade against stock, the rustle of gathered sheaths, the steady breathing of effort. Each bundle laid aside was a small assurance that winter's hunger might be held at bay. The sky remained high and clear for days at a time, a pale vault over the valley. Geese traveled south in wide shifting wedges, their cries marking the season's progress. The smell of smoke hung faintly in the distance where other farms burned stubble or boiled syrup into syrup. This was the richest moment of the year, the brief interlude when granaries filled and shelves gleamed with preserved fruit, when the hands that ached from labor could rest a little on the proof of their endurance. Evenings brought cool air that smelled of frost. The family returned to the cabin with baskets heavy enough to bow the handles. Inside, the fire leapt bright against the deepening night. The sight of piled corn and jars stacked on the table offered a comfort that words could not supply. Yet even in plenty, they measured carefully. Each ear, each bean, each strip of dried meat was counted. Abundance, they had learned, was always temporary. Beyond the clearing, the forest prepared for its own long sleep. Leaves carpeted the ground, muffling sound, turning the world inward. Deer passed silently through the trees, their coats already thickening. The river ran low but fast, flecked with foam from the upstream mills newly built by settlers. Progress whispered at the edges of wilderness, still tentative, but certain. As October deepened, wind tore the last color from the trees. Fields stood bare except for the pale stubble of corn and the dark scars of furrows. Thomas inspected each fence and gate, testing the strength of the rails. Winter demanded foresight. A single weak post could mean lost livestock when snow made repair impossible. He stacked cordwood near the door, layer on layer, until it reached the window ledge. The pile represented more than heat. It was time stored in solid form, every log a memory of sweat and blisters. Inside the house, Mary turned her attention to preservation. Apples hung in strings from the rafters. Pumpkins lined the hearth. Jars of beans and pickled roots filled the cellar. The scent of vinegar and spice mingled with wood smoke.
The children ground corn by hand in a small mill, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Each motion of preparation was both routine and ritual, repeated exactly as the year before because the pattern itself was safety. The weather shifted suddenly in early November. One morning frost rimed the edges of the well and silvered every fence rail. The fields glittered under a weak sun. Breath hung visible in the air. The first snow followed 2 days later. Fine, hesitant flakes that melted on contact but carried the authority of what was to come. The valley fell quiet under its light dusting, as though listening. Within the cabin, the fire took on new importance. Its light became the measure of day and night, its warmth the difference between comfort and peril. The family's world once more contracted to the space around that hearth. Outside lay darkness, wind, and the long endurance of cold. Inside, the slow pulse of life continued in the glow of coals. Winter routines began again. Wood to split, traps to check, livestock to feed. The barns, now sealed against weather, exhaled the heavy scent of hay and animal heat. Snow muffled every sound so thoroughly that even the swing of an axe seemed distant, as though performed behind a curtain. The world had reduced itself to essentials: fire, food, shelter, breath. When storms came, they came with power. Wind screamed down the valley, carrying clouds of snow that erased the horizon. The cabin trembled under the assault, the shutters banging until Thomas secured them with rawhide straps. For hours the family could hear nothing but the roar of wind and the hiss of snow against the roof. Inside, the light flickered and dimmed. They moved little, conserving energy, waiting for calm. When it returned, the world outside had changed again. Fences buried, paths gone, the familiar landscape rendered strange by whiteness. The days that followed were slow and repetitive. The body moved through necessity, while the mind drifted. Each action, adding wood to the fire, stirring the pot, mending a seam, felt both ordinary and sacred. The isolation of winter sharpened awareness of every small thing: the crack of ice breaking on the river, the first ray of sunlight on the floor, the sound of melting dripping from the
The fever passed at last, leaving the family hollow but breathing. Recovery brought no celebration, only gratitude expressed through work resumed. The first clear morning after, Thomas walked to the river to check the traps he had left untended. The snow under his boots gave a faint squeal, and the sun flashed on the frozen surface. Beneath the ice, water whispered its patient song. He returned with little, one rabbit, a handful of fish, but the act itself marked the end of confinement. The world, though still locked and cold, had begun to stir. The months that followed carried a strange stillness. The valley seemed paused between one age and the next. In the distance, along the larger road that cut toward Boston, travelers appeared more often. Traders with wagons of salt, peddlers bearing tools and rumors alike. They brought goods, but they also brought talk, of taxes, of protests, of ships turned back from the harbor. The words meant little here, so far inland, yet they clung to conversation like burrs on wool. Change, it seemed, was moving through the colonies as invisibly as wind. When March thawed the first edges of snow, the world smelled of mud and smoke. Streams overflowed, carrying bits of bark and last year's leaves. The ground yielded underfoot with a wet sigh. The Whitlocks left the cabin door open to the warmer air. Sunlight pooled on the floor, bright and almost foreign after the dim months. The children laughed again, chasing one another through the dripping yard. Their voices carried upward, startling crows from the trees. Repair began before true spring had even arrived. Axe handles were replaced, hinges tightened, traps rebaited. Thomas inspected the plow where rust had eaten through its surface during the long, idle weeks. The colonies produced little iron, and each flaw had to be hammered and filed by hand. He worked in silence, the sound of metal against stone echoing between the barn and the forest's edge. Each spark that leapt from the file was a promise of continuity. Mary cleaned the cabin with almost ceremonial vigor. Bedding hung outside to air, flapping in the weak wind. Floors were scoured with sand until the boards turned pale again. The smell of soap mixed with that of thawing earth. By evening, her hands were red and raw, but the house felt lighter, as if the darkness of winter had been physically removed. April brought a sudden burst of life. Frost retreated overnight, and green appeared everywhere. Grass along the fence line, buds on the apple trees, weeds between the stones of the path. The river broke free with a sound like thunder, chunks of ice grinding against one another before vanishing downstream. The noise filled the valley for days, a reminder that beneath the stillness had always been motion. The Whitlocks returned to their fields. What snow had hidden was revealed again, soil dark and wet, scattered with broken branches. They moved across it in a measured rhythm, clearing, mending, planting. The children dropped seeds into furrows and covered them with careful hands. Above them the sky spread wide and blue, washed clean by the storms. Each breeze carried the smell of pine sap and new grass. By the time May arrived, life had regained its familiar urgency. Work began at dawn and ended only when the stars reappeared. The body's aches from winter confinement faded, replaced by the steady fatigue of motion. The colony's larger tensions felt far away again, reduced to distant rumor by the rhythm of survival. The family's world remained bounded by the fences they had built, by the reach of the plow, by the slow, dependable movement of seasons. Even so, the valley was changing. Where forest had stood untouched a decade earlier, now other farms rose, small houses of unpainted boards, thin spirals of smoke marking each new clearing. The Whitlocks sometimes saw the faint glow of another fire through the trees at night, and knew that the wilderness was retreating, 1 acre at a time. Civilization crept outward, not in grand gestures, but in steady, persistent labor. The wilderness gave ground reluctantly, yet it yielded. As summer approached, the rhythm quickened again. Seeds sprouted, weeds threatened, storms rolled across the ridge and drenched the young crops. The family moved in concert with the weather, every gesture guided by necessity. Each morning began in mist and ended in sweat. Life, renewed after hardship, pressed forward with its own unbroken momentum. Summer settled upon the valley in a flood of green. The hills rolled beneath a canopy of leaves so dense that light itself seemed to grow heavy passing through it. The days expanded until dawn and dusk brushed one another's edges. Sleep became a brief pause between labors. Heat shimmered over the fields, bending the horizon into ripples of light. The Whitlocks rose with the first pale streak of the sky and worked until the air cooled again.
The corn reached higher than a man's shoulder now, its tassels brushing one another in the wind with a whisper like rain. Beans climbed their poles in tight spirals, pods swelling visibly from one day to the next. Squash spread broad leaves across the ground, shading the soil. The smell of growth hung over everything, a mingling of sap, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of pollen. Even the bees sounded content, their droning a low music of abundance. Each morning began with motion, the lifting of water buckets, the tightening of harness, the rhythmic swing of hoe and scythe. The human body, shaped by repetition, responded almost without thought. Sweat darkened linen shirts, streaked with dust until they matched the color of soil. At midday, the family rested under the single oak that stood beside the field, its shadow a cool island in the glare. The air trembled with heat. Distant thunder rolled like breath held too long. Rain, when it came, arrived in violence. Clouds gathered over the ridge, turning the world dim as evening, though it was barely afternoon. Then wind tore across the clearing, bending the corn and thrashing the trees. Sheets of rain followed, blinding and dense, drumming against the roof and earth alike. For an hour the valley vanished in gray water. When it ended, steam rose from the ground, and every leaf glittered as if newly minted. The storm left behind a silence deeper than before, broken only by the slow dripping from branches. Neighbors appeared more often these months. Paths worn between the scattered farms carried both necessity and fellowship. Men borrowed tools, exchanged seed, shared news. Women traded cloth or jars of preserves. Children, who saw one another only rarely through the cold seasons, ran barefoot along the edges of the fields, their laughter startling crows from the trees. The colony, once a scattering of solitary homes, was knitting itself into a community by the simplest of exchanges. At dusk, when work finally released them, the Whitlocks sometimes stood outside to watch the light fade. The western sky deepened from gold to rose to the pure dark of approaching night. Smoke from a dozen homesteads rose in thin columns across the valley, each marking another hearth, another family bound by the same endless labor. Fireflies drifted among the grasses, their slow pulses matching the rhythm of breathing. For those moments, the world seemed complete, contained within the boundaries of sight and sound, untouched by anything beyond the ridge. Yet change moved invisibly, carried on the same wind that bent the crops. Travelers brought it in their stories, pamphlets printed in Boston, talk of meetings, of angry words spoken against governors and kings. Coins grew scarcer, and the price of salt climbed. Some neighbors argued over allegiance, others shrugged and returned to their work. For the Whitlocks, politics remained as distant as the sea, but the tone of conversation shifted. Even isolation could not fully muffle the restlessness spreading through the colonies. Late in July, a stranger passed through the valley, a trader with a small cart of metal goods and bright cloth. He stopped at the Whitlocks' gate to water his horse and share the latest tidings. His stories carried the rhythm of the road. Protests in the cities, ships waiting idle in the harbors, the word boycott was spoken with pride or fear depending on the teller. When he left, the quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet, filled with thoughts that had not existed before. Harvest signs appeared earlier than usual that year. The corn ripened fast under relentless sun. Beans dried on their vines.
For now, though, the Whitlocks moved within the only world they could touch. The light of September fell softer each day, slanting through haze and smoke from distant fires. The air smelled of apples and wood ash. Children gathered fallen fruit, their hands sticky with juice. Inside the cabin, the shelves filled again.
Rows of jars, strings of onions, bundles of herbs darkening as they dried. Order returned, visible and reassuring. Outside, the fields lay stripped, their stubble shining pale beneath the waning sun. Flocks of blackbirds wheeled and settled, feeding on the scattered kernels left behind. The rhythm of harvest drew to a close, and with it came the familiar fatigue of accomplishment. The land would soon rest under snow again, but for a brief moment it stood fulfilled, the year's promise kept. As twilight deepened, the family gathered near the doorway to watch mist lift from the river. The smell of damp earth rose around them. Beyond the woods, an owl called, a long, low note that seemed to stretch the distance between one age and the next. The valley, for now, belonged to peace. But somewhere beyond the hills, change was sharpening its edge. Autumn slid toward winter, almost without warning. One morning, frost clung to the edges of the corn stubble. By the next week, it had become a sheet of ice that glazed the river. The leaves, once crimson and gold, fell overnight in a single rain of color, leaving the trees black and skeletal against a hard sky. The wind carried a sharper note. Smoke from the chimneys rose in straight gray pillars that hung motionless before dissolving. For a few short weeks between harvest and deep cold, the valley lived in uneasy stillness. The Whitlocks' work shifted indoors. Mary rendered fat for candles and soap, poured wax into small tin molds, and tied each wick with steady hands. Thomas mended the harness and the worn edge of his axe handle. Tools were cleaned and set in order along the wall, ready for the next cycle of use. The barn, heavy with grain and stacked wood, smelled of hay and the faint sweetness of apples stored for winter. Each chore completed before the snows came meant a little less worry when the world turned white. The days shortened with startling speed. Dusk fell before the evening meal. Dawn came grudgingly late. The hours between seemed compressed into a single long twilight. The valley, so full of sound and movement through summer, now held its breath. Even the river's voice softened beneath a skin of ice. In that quiet, every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind against the eaves took on weight. Neighbors visited rarely now, appearing only to exchange small goods or news carried from the larger towns. The stories had changed. There were reports of soldiers in the streets, of meetings broken apart, of men vowing to defy royal decrees. The words rebellion and independence entered conversation like sparks in dry grass, spoken quickly, half in pride and half in fear. To the Whitlocks, such talk felt distant, but it carried the same inevitability as weather. Storms that began far away would, sooner or later, find their way to every valley. The first heavy snow arrived before the end of November. It fell thick and wet, clinging to every surface until the landscape vanished beneath a uniform white. Paths disappeared, fences became mere ridges. The family moved carefully, the sound of their footsteps muted. Firewood dwindled faster than expected, and each log burned felt like a coin spent too freely. Thomas rationed it with the same precision Mary used to measure grain. Illness returned with the cold. A chill taken from wet boots, a cough that lingered, small beginnings that deepened into fever. In the dim light of the hearth, Mary mixed herbs from her summer store, their scent sharp enough to cut through the smell of smoke. The children's cheeks glowed with fever's unnatural bloom. The air in the cabin thickened with heat and worry. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them in. When the fever broke, exhaustion remained. The world beyond the windows had grown featureless, sky and earth the same pale gray. Days passed in indistinguishable sequence. The fire's hiss, the slow boiling of broth, and the hollow thump of an axe outside. Yet beneath the monotony ran a quiet gratitude. They were alive. The fire still burned, the roof still held. In a season defined by absence, those facts were abundance. December crept forward. The cold deepened until even breath froze briefly in the air. The forest stood silent, branches rimed with frost so thick they glittered like glass when sunlight struck them. Each morning, Thomas broke ice from the water trough with the blunt side of his axe, the sound echoing like a drum. The rhythm of work had slowed but not ceased. Life persisted through momentum alone. On rare, clear nights, the sky opened in brittle brilliance. Stars burned with a clarity that seemed impossible in warmer months. The world below, stripped of color and noise, reflected that austere beauty. The family gathered close to the hearth, their shadows moving gently across the walls. The logs cracked, sending small showers of sparks upward before settling again. The simplicity of the scene, the fire, the warmth, and the shared silence, contained a dignity as profound as any celebration. Toward the end of winter, a letter arrived, carried by a neighbor from the nearest town. The paper was rough, the handwriting uneven. It spoke of assemblies forming, of petitions sent to the king, of a sense among men that change could no longer be delayed. The letter ended with a phrase that would echo for years: "A new world is being born." Thomas read the words by firelight, his face expressionless, the flicker of the flame reflected in his eyes. Mary continued her work beside him without comment, but the silence between them lengthened. The meaning of those distant events had not yet reached their lives, but its shadow had. Outside, winds swept across the frozen fields, carving drifts into new shapes. The moon rose white and perfect above the ridge. Somewhere beyond that horizon, ships waited in harbors and crowds gathered in streets. Here, only the wolves howled in the distance, and the fire answered with its steady heartbeat of light. January passed as a blur of gray days and long nights. The line between dawn and dusk nearly vanished. Light arrived only to depart. Yet beneath the surface, change stirred again. The logs that once snapped with moisture now burned clean. The snow outside settled into layers, crusted by days of weak sun. The cold still ruled, but it had begun to loosen its grip. The valley emerged slowly from its silence. By late February, the first drips sounded from the eaves, soft, irregular, almost musical. They marked the return of movement. The river, locked for months, cracked and groaned. Water began to show along its edges. The air lost its bitterness, trading sharpness for dampness. The Whitlocks listened to these sounds the way others might read scripture. Each sound promised release. The work of waking the land began before the snow was gone. Thomas hauled the last of the stored grain to the mill in town, guiding the oxen through slush and half-frozen ruts. The road, so empty through winter, now carried travelers again. Farmers, traders, a few soldiers on their way north. The presence of uniforms startled him. They spoke of tension no longer confined to cities. Men along the roadside exchanged glances that were not quite fearful, but no longer indifferent. The colonies were shifting beneath their feet like ice before a thaw. In the cabin, Mary prepared for spring with the same precision she had brought to every season. Seeds sorted, tools inspected, linens aired. The smell of wood choke gave way to the fresher scent of thawing earth. Children carried ashes from the hearth to scatter over the garden beds, their laughter echoing through the clear air. Color returned first to their cheeks, then to the land itself.
browns deepening, hints of green appearing beneath the retreating snow. By March, rivulets streamed down every slope. The forest floor darkened and came alive with the rustle of hidden animals. Flocks of geese crossed the sky, their cries a familiar chorus. Each passing day stretched longer. Evenings glowed with a faint warmth that invited the family outside once more. The world had survived itself. Repair followed thaw. The fences,
Still, even in renewal, the undertone of change remained. Letters passed between distant farms more often now, carried by men who rode fast and spoke little. Pamphlets printed on rough paper found their way into calloused hands. Names of faraway towns, Boston, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, echoed in conversations held over fences and in barns. The words were uncertain but growing bold. Rights, freedom, representation. Each seemed both vast and fragile, ideas too large for the small cabins that now sheltered them. The Whitlocks heard the talk, but did not yet feel its weight. Their days still belonged to soil and weather. The field awaited the plow. Seed corn had to be chosen. Life required attention to what was immediate. But as Thomas walked the boundary of his land, he noticed how sound carried farther now. The valley, once enclosed by its own silence, seemed to listen. Somewhere beyond the hills, drums were beginning to beat, faint but certain. April's warmth arrived at last. Rain fell in steady, nourishing sheets that turned the fields to mirrors. The family moved through mud and sunlight with a kind of reverence. Shoots broke the surface, delicate but determined. The smell of new growth mingled with smoke from the hearth and the faint metallic tang of wet iron. Every sense declared the year reborn. Evenings grew gentle again. The fire no longer roared but glowed in quiet companionship. Outside, frogs sang in the marshes, and a thin mist rose from the river at dusk. Inside, tools rested in order, the shelves once more full. The family sat near the fading firelight, listening to the steady rain on the roof. Nothing about the moment was extraordinary, yet it carried the entire meaning of their world. Labor repaid, hunger held at bay, the land patient beneath their feet. Beyond the ridge, however, the season carried another kind of awakening. Men gathered in meeting houses, voices rising where once they had bowed. In cities far away, muskets were cleaned, powder stored, words sharpened. A transformation was coming, one that would reach even valleys such as this, where history usually arrived only by rumor. For now, the Whitlocks slept under the sound of rain, unaware that the peace surrounding them was already memory. Spring's renewal carried not only life, but consequence. The land they had claimed and tamed would soon belong to a new idea, and every field, every hearth, every quiet human routine would feel its tremor. The valley breathed. The fire dimmed. Dawn waited just beyond the horizon. The year turned restless. Clouds gathered low and fast across the eastern horizon, carrying not rain, but rumor. In towns along the coast, meetings flared like sparks in dry grass. Men spoke of liberty, of grievance, of the price of silence. The sound of that distant fire reached even the Whitlock Valley, muffled by miles, yet impossible to ignore. In the early spring of 1775, the roads filled with movement. Riders passed at all hours, their horses' hooves muffled by mud, but their haste unmistakable. The tavern near the river, once a place for quiet exchange of goods and gossip, became a hub of voices. Letters arrived folded small,
their seals broken quickly, their words carried from hand to hand before the ink had dried. The names written within: Concord, Lexington, were as foreign to the Whitlocks as any kingdom across the sea, yet they carried a weight that settled into every conversation. Thomas Whitlock was older now, his hair touched with gray, and his shoulders still broad but slower to lift the axe. Years of weather had carved lines deep into his face, each one a record of endurance. He read the letters that passed through his neighbors' hands without judgment, then returned to his fields. The corn still had to be planted, the fences still needed repair. Revolutions might stir the cities, but hunger remained the truest master of the countryside. Mary moved through her days with the same quiet steadiness that had shaped her life. The children, grown now, some with families of their own, came and went between the cabin and their own small plots. The valley that had once held only wilderness now bore the marks of community. More houses, a sawmill by the river, the faint clang of iron echoing from the blacksmith's forge. The wilderness had retreated, but in its place had come something equally consuming: change. That summer the first men marched north. They carried muskets wrapped in cloth against rain, their faces solemn, their boots leaving long scars in the muddy road. Neighbors gathered to watch them pass, hats in hand, uncertain whether to cheer or pray. The sound of their departure lingered long after they vanished between the trees. The air itself seemed altered, as if the valley had inhaled and held its breath. For a time life continued in its familiar rhythm. Fields ripened, storms came and went, the cycle repeated. But the stillness beneath that pattern had been disturbed. Each rider who appeared on the road brought tidings that shifted the horizon a little closer. Victories claimed, defeats whispered, new declarations read aloud in distant meeting houses. The idea of a nation, something vast, unseen, and improbable, hovered like weather at the edge of perception. Autumn arrived with a beauty that felt almost fragile. The trees burned with color again, though the sight carried a melancholy weight. The land seemed older, as if aware that innocence had passed from it. Smoke from the harvest fires mingled with the pale haze of distant gunpowder drifting down from the north. The Whitlocks could not see the battles, but the wind carried the scent of them. The iron tang of change, the faint echo of drums beneath thunder. Inside the cabin, the fire burned brighter as nights grew long. The talk of war reached them now not as rumor, but as fact. Neighbors' sons had joined the militias. One man's barn had been turned into a storehouse for grain bound to the front. Horses grew scarce, salt scarcer still. Yet even as the world seemed to tilt toward upheaval, the rhythms of survival remained. Bread still rose in the pot by the hearth. Wood still needed splitting. Births and deaths continued as they always had, indifferent to politics. Winter returned early, heavy and relentless. The family huddled close to the fire, while outside the wind carried distant gunfire, like echoes of a storm over the horizon. Each report arrived faint and delayed, as though time itself stretched between sound and ear. No one spoke of fear, but it hung in the air like smoke. The colony's boundaries were dissolving, its certainties unmade. Yet within the cabin's small circle of light, the world held steady. By the first thaw, new faces appeared on the road. Men in worn coats, their weapons slung across their backs, their eyes bright with exhaustion. They stopped to drink at the well, to rest beside the fence. They spoke briefly of battles fought and comrades lost, of victory claimed in one valley and erased in the next. When they left, the silence they left behind felt different, heavier, as if the valley itself had begun to remember what they described. The seasons turned again. Spring brought its familiar renewal, but now the sound of the plow in the earth echoed against a larger backdrop. The Whitlocks' fields fed not only their household, but soldiers marching beyond the ridge. Grain wagons rumbled along the road where once only deer had passed. The war had arrived without banners, woven quietly into the same pattern as planting and harvest. Through it all, the family endured. Their story, once only of wilderness and work, had become part of something wider. They did not seek it, yet it found them, as inevitable as the tide. The land, scarred by both plow and conflict, continued to yield. Its patience was greater than any army. When the first snow of that new winter fell, Thomas stood in the doorway watching it drift across the fields. The world had changed beyond recognition, yet the sight before him remained the same. White on brown earth, the hush of falling flakes, the steady breath of his own labor, continuing into another year.
Mary's health, however, had begun to falter. The winters pressed harder upon her lungs, and the long hours beside the smoky hearth left her coughing into her apron. She continued her work without complaint, her movements slower but deliberate. The small tasks she once performed without thought, stirring the pot, mending a sleeve, became acts of endurance. The firelight caught the gray in her hair, the fine network of veins in her hands. Time, like frost, left its signature where it pleased. The valley felt older, too. New farms had appeared along the river, their fences joining to form a patchwork of boundaries where once there had been only forest. A road now ran straight through the low ground, its ruts hardened by the passage of wagons carrying supplies to soldiers farther north. The air no longer held only the scent of pine and smoke, but the faint metallic tang of iron. The wilderness had retreated almost out of sight, replaced by the murmur of human permanence. Still, the rhythm of survival remained. The year turned as it always had: seed, growth, harvest, rest. Even as talk of independence filled the meeting house, Thomas marked his days by the color of the sky and the condition of his tools. Freedom to him was the ability to see another dawn and work beneath it. The news that reached the valley grew darker. Men were conscripted, others volunteered and did not return. Fields lay untended in neighboring farms, their owners gone to fight. The sound of hammering filled the evenings as families boarded windows and reinforced doors, not against armies, but against uncertainty. Every settlement, it seemed, had become its own frontier again. In the Whitlock cabin, Mary's cough worsened through another winter. The fire burned almost constantly, its warmth her only comfort. Thomas sat beside her in the long nights, the light from the hearth flickering across their faces. Outside, snow fell in slow, unending sheets, erasing the world they had built. Inside, time narrowed to the space between breaths. When spring finally came, it brought no renewal for her. She died quietly one morning, as sunlight entered through the east window, her hand resting on the blanket she had woven years before. The house, filled for so long with the rhythm of her work, fell silent. The sound of the river carried faintly through the open door, steady and indifferent. Thomas buried her on the rise behind the cabin, where wildflowers bloomed each summer. The earth was soft with thaw, his spade turned it easily. He placed a simple wooden cross at the head of the grave, carving her initials into it with the same knife he had once used to shape handles and pegs. The work steadied his hands. When he was finished, he stood for a long time watching the light shift across the valley. The fields below lay ready for planting. The world,
as always, demanded continuation. He returned to his labor with quiet resolve. Grief, like winter, could be endured only through motion. Each swing of the hoe, each pull of the plow, bound him again to the land that had taken and given in equal measure. The seasons advanced as though nothing had changed, yet everything had. The cabin felt larger now, its silence a second presence that moved through the rooms. At night, when the wind rose, it carried echoes, footsteps, the faint rustle of cloth, the memory of her voice. He did not fear these sounds. They were proof that the world remembered. The war reached its final years. News of battles still traveled slowly, but the tone had shifted. Words like victory and independence appeared more often, spoken with a mixture of pride and disbelief. One evening, a rider brought word that peace might soon be declared. The man was young, his coat torn, his horse streaked with foam. He left as quickly as he had arrived, but his message remained. For the first time in memory, the valley heard celebration, not loud or wild, but quiet, like a sigh released after long restraint. When the next spring arrived, the land seemed to breathe differently. The soil turned rich under the plow, the river ran high, and the sky felt wider somehow. The Whitlock fields, worked now by Thomas's grown children, stretched farther than ever before. New fences marked new beginnings. The country around them was no longer a colony, it had become a nation, though the difference was more visible in words than in daily life. The same sun rose, the same labor filled the hours. Freedom, like the land, demanded maintenance. Thomas aged into this new world quietly. His beard turned white, his steps slowed, but his eyes, still clear, followed the flight of geese across the sky with the same wonder they had held in their youth. He understood that the wilderness would never fully vanish. It lived now in memory, in the stories told beside fires on long nights. The valley that once seemed endless had become a map of endurance, each family its landmark. As another autumn approached, the air took on the familiar scent of smoke and ripe grain. The fields glowed amber beneath a low sun. He walked the boundary once last time, his boots sinking into soft soil, his shadow long behind him. The fences stood firm, the barn full, the cabin roof intact. Everything he had built, everything he had loved, endured. The wind moved through the trees, scattering a few leaves across the path. He paused to listen to their faint rustle, the same sound that had marked the beginning of every season, the eternal language of the land. Winter returned, as it always did, but softer now. The valley no longer felt like a frontier. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and at night the glow of other fires dotted the darkness like small constellations of survival. The wilderness that once pressed close against the Whitlock cabin had retreated to the ridges. In its place stood fields, barns, roads, lines drawn by human hands across what had once been endless. Thomas moved more slowly through this changed landscape. The tools he had once wielded easily now leaned unused beside the barn. His sons and their families tended the fields. His grandchildren carried water from the well, where he had once strained beneath the weight of the buckets. The rhythm of labor continued, but its burden had passed to younger shoulders. He watched them with a mixture of pride and distance, recognizing in their motion the echo of his own years. Inside the cabin, the hearth still burned. The same stones he had laid decades before now glowed red beneath fresh embers. The acid air about its chimney still smelled of pine and smoke, of bread baking and damp wool drying by the door. Those scents carried entire histories. Each reminded him of the years when silence was broken only by the crack of the axe and the laughter of children no longer small. He spent his days in quiet tasks, mending harness straps, sorting nails, sharpening the small knife that had served him half a lifetime. In the evenings, he sat on the porch and watched the light fade from the fields. The land shifted color with the hour, gold to gray to blue, until only the line of trees against the sky remained. The world he saw was both familiar and new, altered by hands that had never known the fear or hunger of its beginnings. That continuity comforted him more than any sermon could. The nation outside the valley was still finding its shape. Riders carried news of treaties signed, of borders drawn, of leaders chosen from among men who had once been farmers themselves. The word America appeared on letters and coins, its sound both strange and inevitable. The valley's people spoke it carefully, as though testing the strength of something newly forged. For those who had labored through the years of wilderness, it represented not glory, but endurance confirmed. Age, when it finally took hold, came quietly. Thomas's sight dimmed first, then his hearing. He learned to read the world by touch, the grain of wood beneath his fingers, the warmth of sunlight on his sleeve. He rose each morning out of habit rather than need, sitting by the window to watch the day begin. The mist that rose from the river reminded him of every dawn he had ever seen. The valley had become a memory made visible, every line of it familiar as the veins on his own hand. In his final winter, snow came early again. It fell steadily for days, covering the fields, the fences, the roof. The cabin stood half buried, its windows glowing softly from within. He spent long hours beside the hearth, listening to the wood hiss and settle. The fire's rhythm matched his heartbeat, slow, measured, persistent. Outside, the world lay still, muffled beneath its white silence. Each flake that fell seemed a note in a song he had known all his life. When the thaw came that year, it carried with it the scent of pine sap and river mud. Thomas felt its change in his bones.
He was buried beside Mary on the rise behind the house. The family gathered in silence while snowmelt trickled through the grass. The wooden crosses that marked their graves leaned slightly toward one another, weathered but still legible. From that small hill, the valley stretched wide and bright, the river gleaming in the distance. The land he had tamed looked peaceful, yet alive with motion, the eternal breathing of seasons. Years passed. Children became adults, and their children took their place. The cabin aged with them, its timbers darkened by smoke, its roof patched and repatched. New tools appeared on the walls, iron forged in towns, cloth from distant mills. The world had moved beyond the raw austerity of those early years, but the memory of them remained embedded in every board, every stone. When storms rolled through, the house creaked like a living thing, carrying voices that no one could name. The valley itself flourished. The rough track that had once served as a road became a proper route for wagons. Later, coaches passed bearing passengers who spoke of cities and inventions unimaginable to those who had first cleared the land. Yet, beneath that progress lay the same soil turned by Thomas's hands, the same water drawn from the same well. Time, for all its reach, could not erase origin. On summer evenings, the descendants of the first Whitlocks sometimes walked to the rise where their ancestors lay. From there, the view stretched across fields bordered now by neat hedges and dotted with barns. The setting sun poured gold over everything it touched. They spoke little, but each understood that what they saw, the order, the peace, the quiet prosperity, had been purchased by lives measured in labor. The graves on the hill were not symbols, but foundations. The wind that passed over those stones carried with it the scent of grass and distant smoke, the same mixture that had filled the air on the first morning the valley was settled. It was the smell of the beginning and of continuity, inseparable. The Whitlocks, known or forgotten, had become part of the landscape itself, a story written in the language of seasons, legible to anyone who looked closely. When night fell, the fields darkened slowly, and the first stars appeared above the ridge. Their light, unchanged across all generations, gleamed faintly on the river below. The valley slept, and the land held the memory of everyone who had ever worked it. Decades passed, and the country settled into the long rhythm of peace. The struggle that had once shaken every settlement became a story told beside hearths on winter nights. The new nation learned to breathe, its pulse steadying between the cadence of work and the slow unfolding of its ideals. Roads lengthened, towns grew, ships filled the harbors that had once been guarded by foreign flags. Yet beneath the clamor of progress lay the quiet persistence of fields, rivers, and seasons, unchanged, patient, eternal. The Whitlock Valley endured as part of that continuity. What had begun as one family's clearing in the wilderness had become a cluster of farms joined by hedgerows and stone fences. Apple trees planted by long-vanished hands now shaded generations that would never know the fear of isolation their ancestors once felt. The air in summer carried the hum of bees and the soft rattle of wagon wheels on packed earth. Children ran along paths where deer had once fled at the sight of a single human figure. The old cabin still stood, though weathered and bowed. Its boards had darkened to the color of the soil. Moss crept up its foundation stones. But its hearth remained sound. Its chimney still breathed smoke each winter. Inside, a new family lived, distantly related by blood and more deeply bound by inheritance of labor. They tended the same plot, drew water from the same well, and spoke the same quiet gratitude at the sight of sunrise. Every generation added something: a new beam, a new tree line, a new story told to children who would one day tell it again. In this layering of years lay the true monument of the colonial world, not marble or inscription, but continuity. The past was not buried here, it breathed through every action. The swing of an axe, the kneading of bread, the mending of cloth, each gesture repeated across centuries until it became indistinguishable from prayer. As the 19th century approached, travelers from distant cities sometimes paused in the valley, remarking on its calm. To them it looked untouched by history, a relic of simpler days. They did not see the labor that shaped it, the quiet endurance that had transformed wilderness into home. History, like the land, hid its foundations beneath growth. The Whitlock story was no longer visible in faces or names, yet it remained in the order of the fields, in the alignment of fences with the river's curve, in the persistence of morning smoke against the hills. Spring still arrived with the same clarity it had on that first remembered morning. Mist rising from thawing ground, the air filled with birds returning from distance. Summer still brought its deep hum of insects, autumn its gold and ash, winter its stern silence. Each season carried within it the ghost of all that had come before. The people who worked this ground moved through time as if through weather, feeling its changes but never mastering it. In the small burying ground on the rise, the earliest wooden crosses had long since decayed, replaced by simple stones whose carvings had softened beneath rain and lichen. The names were still legible in part, the dates spanning the birth of a colony and the life of a nation. Visitors sometimes paused there at sunset, reading the faint letters and tracing them with their fingers. Few recognized the significance of those names beyond their own kinship, yet the valley itself remembered. The earth keeps what paper forgets. When evening descended, the valley returned to its oldest state. Silence broken only by the wind moving through trees. The river glowed faintly under the moon, its current steady and its surface reflecting the same constellations that had watched over the first settlers. The cabins, barns, and fences all seemed small against that eternal light. Yet they were part of it now, just as those who built them were part of the soil they once turned. The story of how people actually lived in colonial America was never written in proclamations or victories. It was written in motion, the turning of soil, the gathering of firewood, the hands that mended, built, carried, birthed, buried. It was a life of proximity to earth and season, of faith and repetition, of quiet courage unrecorded but essential. Their endurance built the unseen structure upon which everything later stood. Even now, when wind passes across an old field or when a hearth fire snaps in the night, the echoes of those lives resurface. They remind us that nations are not born in moments, but in accumulations, in the weight of ordinary days, in patience, in survival. Colonial America was not only a beginning, it was the proving ground of persistence itself. And so as we close this long journey through time, picture the valley once more, at dawn. Mist lifting from the river, the first light touching roofs and fences, smoke curling into the cool air. The world is quiet, suspended between past and present. Somewhere, unseen, a door opens and footsteps cross a threshold into another day of work and endurance. The story continues, as it always has, measured in heartbeats, in breath, in the steady hum of life upon the land. If you've traveled this far through the world they built, through their winters and harvests, their fears and quiet triumphs, take a moment to reflect on what endures, the ordinary courage of living. And if you'd like to keep exploring stories like this, tracing the hidden threads of history that still shape our days, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next journey through time.